Okay, let's go. Welcome, everyone, to our panel titled Subjectivity, Sensory Perception, and the Body in Cinema. I will be moderating this session, and I will present the first paper in our panel today. I am Arzu Karaduman. I am a visiting lecturer at Marist College in New York. And the title of my paper is Critically Listening to the Anasonic Zone of Interest. Ses? Aynen. O zaman kapatalım. Tamam, dönelim slayda. Burdened with the intergenerational trauma of the Holocaust, Jonathan Glazer... Is it playing? Oynuyor mu? Jonathan Glazer shares his concern about our close proximity to this terrible event in the zone of interest. İleri gittiniz. Oynamayacak değil mi? Okay. In his Oscar speech, the director condemned the growth of right-wing populism everywhere that leads to acts of violence. In an ethical Derridian gesture, he asked, quote, whether the victims of October 7th in Israel or the ongoing attack on Gaza, all the victims of this dehumanization, how do we resist, end quote. The zone of interest resists by inventing a new cinematic aesthetic that breaks with what K.J. Donnelly calls, quote, the linchpin of sound cinema, end quote. That is, synchronization, in such a way that there are technically two films in one, the one we see and the one we hear, as the filmmaker also describes it. Returning to the manifesto of the first truly political filmmakers in the history of cinema, namely the Russian montagists from the Moscow School in the 1920s, the zone of interest displays the powers of montage through its juxtaposition, or in other words, its distinct non-synchronization of the cinematographically captured idyllic and pastoral beauty with its soundtrack. As we watch the everyday activities, such as gardening and laundry in the family home of Commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss, the background sounds protrude and conflict with the sterility and beauty in the images. These sounds include and blend the machinery of the death camp, the crematorium filled with hundreds of people, the hum of the footsteps, and the workshops, without singling out any distinct sound on its own. They make up the undulation, in the director's words, that gets layered and calibrated throughout the film. Glazer notes that there were about 80 gunshots a day during the political executions. Sometimes it is a clearly audible gunshot, or to put it more accurately, multiple gunshots that we hear testifying to the killings, like in the scene of Hedwig trying on a lipstick she found in the fur coat of a murdered Jewish woman. Can we just play the clip for a second? Ses yok değil mi? Hiçbir anlamı yok. Okay. Like in the scene of Hedwig trying on a lipstick she found in the fur coat of a murdered Jewish woman, or the scene in which dozens of officers are gathered to celebrate Höss's birthday, shaking hands with him and expressing how honored they are to serve under him. The audiovisual counterpoint in the scene of each gunshot heard at the same time and officer shouts, "Happy birthday, Commandant," is followed by a visual montage when we cut from the grins on the faces of the blissfully ignorant SS officers to Höss's two boys playing in their rooms. While the older one is dressing into a Nazi uniform, the younger boy is playing with toy soldiers and rifles on the floor. Throughout the film, we witness the children and the babies acknowledge and respond to the ongoing terrors of the war and extermination, while the adults, in their zone of complicity, in the words of Nietzsche and Lebovich, quote, as complicit parties, avoid, suppress, and disregard the crimes committed outside their windows or beyond their walls, end quote. Lebovich emphasizes the film's refusal of the quote, the metaphysical opposition between event and non-event, perpetrator and victim, active and passive positions, end quote, in his discussion of complicity, presented as a spectrum in the film which forces us to think and work against such complicity. For Naomi Klein, in her Guardian piece titled "The Zone of Interest is about the danger of ignoring atrocities, including Gaza," the film's discursive intervention is its unveiling of, quote, the human capacity to live with holocausts and other atrocities, to make peace with them, draw benefit from them, end quote. Ghassan Hage, engaging with Klein in his reading of the film's ethnographic dimension, names this complicity necropolitical indifference, that is, an intentional indifference towards that which is highly significant in one's own effective space of existence, which this indifference, right, for Ghassan Hage, necropolitical indifference, quote, is not a result of racism, but rather one of its key defining features, end quote. Hage distinguishes desensitization, or in other words, learning to see but not feel anything, from indifference that he defines as, quote, a form of de-intensifying the presence of something in our surrounding, where we learn not to see or hear or smell, etc., end quote. Similarly, I find the film's politics of indifference, or call it complicity a la Klein or Lebovich, aesthetically emphasized through the constant audibility of the camp beyond the garden wall as a reminder of the audiovisuality, as a reminder of the avisuality of the ongoing extermination streamlined for efficiency. Akira Lippitt theorizes avisuality as a mode of visuality that cinema shares with psychoanalysis and the X-ray, all born in the same year at the end of the 19th century. He defines avisuality as that which is visual in nature but invisible, as an, in, quote, impossible, unimaginable visuality, end quote. The, quote, very invisibility of the invisible within the visible, end quote, in the zone of interest is rendered audible, haptic, and olfactory. It is kept out of sight and sensed through the ears, the skin, and the nose. But in the Big Brother-style surveillance of Nazi anti-Semitic racism of the characters in the setting of the Nazi house, those senses and sensations are intentionally disregarded and frequently unaddressed. Hage's distinction between desensitization and indifference through de-intensification is crucial in the frame of the film's rejection of the typical pornifying gaze at the horrific acts of genocide in Holocaust movies, whose hypervisibility is argued to be guilty of increasing desensitization, apathy, and hence complicity in audiences, in us. Glaser argues, quote, we have become desensitized to them. It's impossible to show what happened inside those walls. And in my opinion, one shouldn't try, end quote. Herzog explains the typical representations of fascism as the commercial Holocaust film's comforting distance and safe spectator positions that should be read as a fascism of representation through their mystification and resultant veneration that brings ignorance. Herzog argues that the zone of interest instead works as what philosopher Gillian Rose calls a, quote, Holocaust ethnography, end quote, that demands self-introspection for our own capacity for violence and identification. Trying to avoid the artifice of cinema and glamorization or fetishization of what the camera shoots, and to bring a more forensic look instead, Glazer's method distanced itself from the typical movie set and hence did away with artificial lighting, film gear, and crew on the set, the Atmos mix, as well as wall-to-wall music. The film was shot with 10 hidden cameras with no crew on set and hour-long takes each time as the family went by their day. It was about capturing the sound of people rather than their dialogue captured by 20 different microphones for each take, rather than by a guy with a boom, as the sound designer John Burns explains. Resisting the typical pornifying gaze that aestheticizes genocide for commercial profit, the zone of interest turns its gaze inwards and asks us to listen attentively to the blend of many sound marks that attest to the horrors of the Auschwitz-Birkenau zone of interest. Bellowing chimneys of the crematorium, gunshots, dogs barking, prisoners wailing and screaming in pain. That is the soundscape of extermination and genocide. Separated by a wall from the heavenly garden Hedwig builds, the blocking of the otherwise visible horror fits the first order of invisibility as explained by Derrida in The Gift of Death. That of the visible invisible, temporarily hidden from sight, secret and outside, as Lippitt puts it. The film renders the genocide a visual, not only through a wall that hides the secret the host family chooses to strategically avoid, but also through the acousmatic sounds that are heard, but whose sources or causes remain unseen. So about the acousmatic, Brian Kane, who wrote a book on acousmatic sound, unseen sound, explains that Schaeffer talked about acousmatic sound's nature being uncanny, unsettling, or unsettled. But Kane explains the unsettling nature of acousmatic sounds comes from what it comes from is that this sound object that we hear is never completely autonomous, right? There's this sense of nearly but not quite autonomous nature of the sound because its source can always pop up and be visible anytime on the screen. That effect, the idea that this sound is kind of tied to its shadow, right, of image, the shadow of source and cause that it cannot separate itself from, that it cannot escape, because without it, technically, acousmatic sound would not exist, right? It would dissipate. So in this film, what we hear, all these sounds coming from the other side of the wall are basically presented to us in that nature, right? We are constantly expecting, and yet they never appear. Which reminds me of the keynote yesterday that Mike Wayne gave, right? The dialectical image, that constant tension that we find also in the juxtaposition of Soviet-style montage. Besides the auditory, the haptic, and the olfactory, occasionally, the haptic and the olfactory occasionally transgress the protected borders of visual necropolitical indifference throughout the movie. The sonic, haptic, and olfactory are explained through the second order of invisibility, that is, absolute invisibility that falls outside the register of sight, according to Derrida. The haptic is exemplified in the swimming and fishing scene when Höss realizes the ashes and remains of the cremated bodies have floated down the river and stained his kids and his own white skin by touching and sticking to them. Höss rushes back home to scrub off the touch of Jewishness from his own and his children's bodies, which later sticks to the bathtub that then gets cleaned by the Polish servant. Höss, in a later scene, rapes a Jewish woman and repeats the act of exaggerated scrubbing, this time from his sex organ of his rapist racist fantasies. The olfactory, similarly, is exemplified in the scene of Hedwig's mom. Hedwig's mom waking up coughing in the garden and seeing the smoke coming out of the chimneys, a sign of engineered, streamlined, and accelerated extermination. In her room, after the dinner announcement of the father's transfer, which he phrases as a sacrifice worth pursuing for the sake of the family's enjoyment in the zone of interest, the grandmother is seen watching the chimneys spew out the smoke, repulsed by the memory of their invasion through her facial orifices earlier. The next morning, Hedwig learns from the servants that her mother has already left and finds the note that she has left behind. This note is possibly the note the mother left, right? Possibly of indicating or telling her of the mother's inability to perform the same level of necropolitical indifference or ignorance, is the secret archive of genocide, seen and read only by Hedwig herself before she rushes to burn it to its ashes. The logic of the archive inhabits a predestined self-annihilation, what Derrida calls le mal d'archive, an archive viewer, or in other words, death drive. The archive is founded on a constitutive problem, as its principle is one that cannot be archived. The RK, as, quote, the originary, the first, the principle, end quote, resists archivization and burns to a resultant secret archive. That is, quote, the very ash of the archive, the figure of another archive of secrets, end quote, that constitutes the archive from its ashes, it is cinders in the first place. Anne Berg claims the extraordinariness of the film results from its inversion of, quote, the gaze that has accompanied atrocity ever since the advent of photography, end quote. Building on the film breaking with the capitalistic oculocentrism of Western filmmaking practices, I argued the zone of interest operates anasonically through the unthinkable and at times barely audible sounds that evoke potentially numerous images of extermination that contradict the blissful indifference of the perpetrators under surveillance. Before I explain anasonicity, I would like to turn to the sound designer Johnny Byrne, who had to soundproof the room of his house he uses as his office space for this film. The most violent film, he says, that he ever had to work on, and yet the only one that doesn't show any of such violence. Byrne explains that, quote, we process visual images whereas we react to sounds with our subconscious and primal brain appending history, artifacts, and nouns to what we hear, end quote. He emphasizes they aimed for historical accuracy and faithfulness to the atrocities in their sound design of the film, in which they tried to avoid sensationalization. He collected sounds such as of heavy industry, soldiers marching, the echo of the orchestra that played inside Auschwitz, and riots in Paris to record Frenchmen shouting, for example, or football matches in Germany to record aggressive fans on the street in the real world that are more convincing than any voice actor could ever imitate, and plus a vintage Nazi motorcycle, because guess what? They had to constantly run motorcycles in Auschwitz to drown out the screams to preserve the sanity. It is the impossibility of showing the atrocities one more time, of sensationalizing and commercializing pain through cinematic conventions of synchronization, pornifying genocide that demands an Anasonic approach to ethically represent and forensically see and ethnographically document the necropolitical indifference, the family's desensitization to the atrocities next door, the oft-cited and cliché term by Arendt, in other words, the banality of evil. Thank you. Next, our next speaker will be Igor Pop-Trajkov from the Philosophical Society of Macedonia. Igor Pop's paper is titled, Trajkov's paper is titled The Self Through the Subjective Camera, a comparative analysis of its beginnings in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Lady in the Lake. Do we have Igor with us?
geliyor mu? Açabildin mi sesini? Dr. Trechko, can you hear us? Host yap. Ah. Hello.
Sorry, I would like to ask, I think that I'm the second, actually not the third, because if I am the third, there is a speech in this group, so maybe it is time for me to start or not. Shall I start now? Or?
Yes, Igor,
Yes.
do you hear us?
Yes, I can, and I can now turn on the camera, as you can see.
If you are ready, you are welcome to start.
Yes, okay.
I introduced you.
I emailed you a video prepared so that we won't have a technical difficulties. But if you like, I can start like this. The video is not, I don't know, something special because I recorded it with my phone from the computer screen, as you can see, because I couldn't record on Zoom or those other programs I had. So I should start now, yes?
Yes, of course. Did you want the
Or
video?
you will play the video? What did you, I saw that you downloaded it, so what did you decide? I think it's better to play the video because there can be usually technical problems in our region, but if you like, I can start, okay?
Okay.
I have here the text and I will play the PowerPoint presentation. Okay. Okay.
Yes.
I guess I shall start, yes?
Yes.
Is everybody okay?
Yes,
Do like
yes,
this, and
we are.
those that don't have access, raise your hand. Or you cannot raise your hand. Okay, I'm starting. Just a second. Okay, I cannot now. Now your Cinephilosophy is now the host, or I can. Let me see. No, I can. Okay.
Do you see the
Oh, you will
PowerPoint?
play it. Okay.
Igor, do you see?
Super. Or no, it's me. Okay.
Host oldu değil mi?
Şu anda da aldınız mı yeri?
Who is the host?
I cannot share it.
Paylaşamıyorum diyor.
Biz paylaşmıştık çünkü.
Recording in progress.
Tamam, buradan ses aldık biz.
Okay,
Yes.
the slides.
The slides.
Let me see. Because I cannot screen. Now I can. Just a second.
Okay.
Okay. Now I can.
Can you?
Yes, now I can. Thank you for letting me do it. But I think it's better if you play it because you see what's happening. But okay, I'm starting. So, believe it or not, ever since the times of the POV point of view, first-person subjective camera shoot was present in the film industry. It was source of greatest tension, sexual desire, melancholy, chase of memories, emotionality, or greed. According to some researchers, 40% of the Hollywood productions in the 30s were using this form of expression. We don't know how did they come to the idea for this, since the prevailing discourse is that the aesthetical innovations which occurred in the first wave of immigration in Hollywood were originated from the fact that these filmmakers, as well as entrepreneurs, the owners of the first studios, were all running away from some form of repression, dictatorship, or censorship. As a reaction of this, they were pushing for stronger expression and illumination of the prevailing discourse, that everything should be available. In a sense, everyone's thoughts and everything should be open-minded, triggering the ever-present question of the freedom of expression. In my paper proposal, I named two filmmakers, Ruben Mamoulian and Robert Montgomery. The first one is indeed from the Soviet Union, however, the second one is very American, not only a filmmaker, but also a successful politician. I chose these two not only for the aesthetical reasoning, but also for their cultural background. And as we saw many times throughout the history of cinema, what was a good in one aesthetical solution with one intention can become more successful with another. Mostly used example for this is the editing technique of attraction invented by the Russian communist Dziga Vertov for the purpose of creating propaganda for the proletariat, which became most prolific in the film and TV commercials. The idea of associating the most innovative solutions with the mainstream audiences is very old, as it is believed the innovations always attract great audiences, which was not firstly the case with the 3D technique, of course. Many of the findings of the late Kuleshev's ideas for the POV camera were evidently brought to USA by the director, Mamoulian. This experiment shows same reaction of the face of the actor, but edited with three different shots 3 times, so the audience believed the actor acted 3 different situations. The truth was the actor was all of the time the same, as it was the situation with the whole country of the Soviet Union, of course then. However, the director Ruben Mamoulian evidently accepted the culture of the new world, which was very much for the technical and aesthetical innovations if we focus on the film industry. This coincides inversely with the philosophical interpretations of Zadek, who somewhat criticizes the techno evolution by claiming they have technology. In a sense, the Westerners tend to transform people into machines. However, John Dewey undoubtedly defines that the democracy depends on the development of the technology. In this line, we can examine the usage of the POV camera in the case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as an example of self-expression of the character and the will of his self to prevail. The subjective camera movement, when used in this movie, by its sharp, decisive fastness and by the appearance of the actor's reflection in the mirror, we can assume his self is full with greed, self-indulging, boyish curiosity, and endless pretension. In his character, we can find the traces of the bureaucratic dictatorship in the by the director-led environment of the Soviet Union. Why I think this research of mine is accurate and necessary? Because nowadays, when estimating by the development of the new technologies, we can locate the usage of the covering data, which covers the real, the truthful information. This old cinematic masterpiece reveals this situation, since we can see how the twisted personality can outplay the reality by hiding in different body and subject. Is there an alter ego at all? Or the ego is just gaining more power with, in this case, the spatial potion. Like nowadays, we can witness this power being obtained with the help of the bots in the social media, which I had on a previous slide. The sexuality of the monster, amongst others, is also revealed through its violent needs, for which the solid matrimonial relation is not enough. No wonder the director of this innovative production is someone from the East, since there we can find the drastic, historically rudimental atavisms of the dictatorships preserved as ultimate form of patriotism. Whoever seeks for democracy within this kind of Eastern culturing could not possibly find it in the Eastern European patriots. In the time of the golden years of Hollywood, all Democrats, all seekers for civil liberties were running away from the East. That is why the civil libido has to be radically relieved in the presence of the prostitutes, epitomized in the image of corrupted Europe in the eve of the World War II. The Lady in the Lake, from the very mainstream star Robert Montgomery, is a very innovative production in many ways, not just by the usage of the fully POV aesthetics, but as well for one of the first creation of double-chase detective story, the choral music, the picturesque Christmas setting in the genre of the detective story, etc. This is to say that mainstream commercial production can also be source of big innovation, inspiration, and development of the film form. In this case, unlike in the previous one, the self is used for the expression of the Puritan, conservative side of the modern existing, when the tentacles of the corruption are putting their dark stain on the lives of the characters. In this case, the somewhat perfect romantic duo. Lacan's self or ego or I identity is always on some level a fantasy, an identification with an external image and not an internal sense of separate whole identity. This is why Lacan calls the phase of demanded and mirror stage the realm of imaginaries. This is by Claes. In Lacanian terms, identification can be described as an example of a capitation, a process in which an object in the external world, which is most frequently another person, captivates the subject so much that it becomes a complement in the subject's self-image. This is by Fiore. In this case, the self is the male and the mirror. The external world is the female counterpart. With Hegel, we got the idea that the self is built, and is this through our relations with others, but that leaves the unclear question of who it is. Lacan follows Freud in claiming that the Cartesian picture of self is misleading because it neglects the unconscious, everything unconscious in a sense. For both Lacan and Freud, the self is something that we built largely injecting material dish on us by other people. Our self is an imaginative creation. This is by Linsen Ma, but also by Christian Metz, because I'm referring here his imaginary signifier, his book. The self is in Lady in the Lake is being built very conscientiously, although conscientiously by the both characters. The Christmas atmosphere and the enlightened cinematography are reflecting the warmth in the society that protects the family by its constitution. In 1952, the director and actor Robert Montgomery gained popularity when he began working as television coach for the US President Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was very conservative, perhaps something like Schwarzenegger now, also being one of the first presidents of the Screen Actors Guild, something like Ronald Reagan. He was president, and he was with their syndicates. In the case of the Lady in the Lake, the repressed libido, as described by Christian Metz, is also offered to the audience, but by the two scared partners. So what was presented in this film was also very present in the golden years of Hollywood, even in the pre-code period. Ownership of the POV camera and the expression of the self through it possibly continued and was developed by some of the greatest authors of the mainstream cinema, motivationally perhaps for demonstrating its presence, as the self is mostly present in the American culture unlike the prevailing repressions everywhere else. Perhaps this is the most authentic American cinematic form of expression. This was developed, example in Gratia, by Hitchcock in almost all of his films. Steven Spielberg went a step further by replacing the following: the second shot by the expression of the actor's face. Hitchcock didn't want to meet with Spielberg because he gave the rights of Jaws to the studios, but Spielberg did a magnificent job placing the POV shot of in Jaws in the place of the shark by opposing the self of the feeding shark to humans who are always in need of something, although they always have some food. At least in this movie, the self of people is not as that of an animal. Lately, the self is very much present in the mainstream 3D or not productions, as partially in the comics screen adaptations. We can recognize the above-mentioned discourse between the self in repression and the self in danger of being conservative as an output of the comparison between the Mamoulians and Montgomery's talkies. These two productions also define the position of the self as superego or as a heroic one, as the first one is before and second one after the World War II. However, the self in the first case is an irresponsible one, which cannot be said for the second film mentioned here. Since the first one is irresponsible European-like director, unlike the second self, which believes there should be low responsibility for every action. However, both productions do define self should be responsible for those actions, regardless if they are villains or done by the villains or by the victims. Since since there is difference in the normative historic and the contemporary world. In the historical norm, based on the classics like Cicero's and Augustine, Thucydides, etc., with methods that are comparative and descriptive, especially those in the Old Testament, while as unlike the contemporary norm, which is a compilation of war ethics and applied educational ethics. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. I would like to believe that I was interested enough to follow my 15 minutes. Sorry.
Thank you.
So I guess now you can ask me questions. In the program it says that after the discussion or after all of the
after all, if we have
so
time,
now you
Igor.
can ask me a question or afterwards, whenever you like.
Yes, we can go later, maybe, Igor. Thank you so much.
Later, okay. Okay, so now I will mute myself and I will turn off the camera, yes?
If you like, if you prefer, yes. So our next...
Oh, you're like an echo, like in Hitchcock's Vertigo. I can hear your voice.
Yes, it's real. Allah.
So later, after all the debaters, you will ask me a question, yes?
Yes, if we have time later. Thank you so much, Igor.
Or you want now?
No, we'll do it later. Thank you. So our next speaker will be Ioannis Mitsou.
I can see how beautiful is this cinema hall, very beautiful, and the environment, it's kind of interesting.
Thank you. Yes.
Like in Michelangelo's movies from the 60s.
I know. It's a beautiful
kind
auditorium.
Of intellectual.
Yes. Cermodern. We are in Cermodern in Ankara, a new location here, very popular.
You can ask me in French or Italian or German. I know these languages too.
Okay. I doubt we'll have questions in other languages. I mean, but we'll see. So our third speaker, Ioannis Mitsou, Ioannis's, Mitsou's paper is titled Medieval Narratives and Representations of Subjectivity, Corporeality, and Transcendence in Tarkovsky's Andrei, Rublev, and Pasolini's Il Fiore del Mille e una Notte, or in English, 1001 Nights. I hope I didn't butcher this title.
If you like to turn me off, you turn me off, or otherwise you cannot return the...
Kapatabilirsiniz beni diyor. Okay, thank you. We'll do that. Yapabildiniz mi? Ya, Ioannis'e geçebildik mi? Ioannis'e geçiyor. Ioannis, can you hear us? Ioannis, can you hear us?
Dr. Mitsou, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you. Should I begin?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
It's
beautiful to be here with you in this beautiful cinema house to share the moment. As we are talking today about cinematic narratives, visual ways to interpret and recreate reality, I would like to begin our communication with two images. In the opening shots of Andrei Rublev, a fantasy of the 15th century, in a yet unidentified time and place that already in its ambiguity seems to allude to the medieval past, an attack takes place near an abandoned church in an isolated area by the river. A villager, a Russian villager named Yefim, attempts to fly in a primitive balloon patched together out of skins and other raw material to escape his pursuers, a group of attackers. As he sets off, there is a sense of accomplishment, a dreamlike quality, even if momentary, like Yefim's flight, an emphasis on the subjective feeling of transcendence overshadows what we would conventionally call suspense, a rational interest in his fate. His inevitable crash is followed by the shot of a horse, rolling over in slow motion in the ground. The events, enigmatic in nature, are unrelated to the plot and, up to an extent, to the thematic heart of the subsequent events of the film. The second image is similarly sensual and enigmatic. A young boy called Nurandin is wandering in the Arabic world, this enigmatic time and place, defined by Edward Said as the realm of Orientalism. And yet, at the same time, it is a world extremely natural and corporeal, stemming from the conventions of Italian neorealism, not the exoticism of Hollywood epics. I am referring, of course, dear friends, to the film by Pier Paolo Pasolini, Arabian Nights, from 1974. So a world of materiality inhabited by everyday people whose physical features, their tendency to laugh and their movement evoke an international working class. But Nurandin is crying. He is looking for the woman he loves. She was stolen from him. A veiled young woman with piercing eyes apparently mistakes him for a porter. She takes him to a local market where they buy various dishes and other goods. He follows her without protesting, slightly melancholic, curious, and open to the unexpected experience. Stories of love and companionship. In today's presentation, we explore the relationship between the notion of medievalism in its various connotations, notably its aesthetic aspects, And the iconography of Andrei Tarkovsky's Andrei Rublev, the 1966 film, and Pier Pasolini's 1001 Nights from 1974. So our focus is not as much in the spiritual aspects of this exploration as it is in the human body, in the corporeal sensual element. This sensuality is not too far away from the almost fetishistic emphasis on physical violence. In Pasolini's film, the same idea, the idea of violence, of sensuality, is linked with the existence of various stories in everyday life. So Pasolini uses the same convention of stories within stories, familiar in the Eastern narrative and way of thinking. The connotations of the opening line, attributed to the book of 1001 Nights, is notable. Truth does not lie in one dream, but in many dreams. So in many dreams, not in one dream. The desired transcendence is achieved through the affair, through the flesh, through the focus of the human body, and in many ways, in many stories, not in one solitary dream. One would be tempted to interpret such vivid images through surrealism or through psychoanalysis, right, through dream. But Tarkovsky's often stated skepticism towards both movements on the one hand, and the recognition of a totally different cultural background on the other, indicate that any reading founded in symbolistic principles could be easily proved to be misleading. In this way, to address such difficulties, our presentation attempts an alternative interpretive point of view. It explores the relationship between some philosophical existential themes and motifs, namely the often misunderstood relationship between corporeality and transcendence, human body on the one hand and flight on the other. Andrei Rublev, rooted in Eastern existential philosophical traditions, perceives the world not only through subjectivism, but also as a work of art, as a field to be experienced. Memory, lust, the feelings of loss and grief and other inner conditions are always attributed to corporeal expressions, and the necessity of art, the main theme of the narrative, is always to be understood in relation to a material reality, an outside situation. Our main argument is that in Tarkovsky's films, and Andrei Rublev in particular, the desired transcendence is achieved, as we said, through the flesh, through the conscious focus of both the narrative structure and the imagery on the human body. So, the need for the artist to observe and inhabit the world poetically in the literal verbal sense, that is, creatively, is a natural extension of this corporeal priority. In this respect, phenomenology, as expressed notably by Maurice Merleau-Ponty, a thinker who cares about this motif, proves to be more than a tool for reading the film. Works like Phenomenology of Perception share with Andrei Rublev an emphasis on the flesh. It is the same urgent need and desire that Pasolini's films express and seek to depict. The eroticism they suggest as narratives, the erotic, sometimes seem to be devoid of Christian guilt, depicted as innocent and prayerful. Take the liberating eroticism that dominates his trilogy of life, but other times it is described visually as sadistic and frightening, socially aware and rebellious, but also a product of oppression. These contradictions are the main themes that Pasolini's films structure seek to reconcile, both aesthetically and theoretically. So, according to Pasolini's narrative, it is essential to dedicate oneself with the world of experience and by extension with the many stories that life seems to construct rather than escape from it. It is such a wonder indeed that moves the plot, as the young hero, Nurandin is his name, seeks for a savior that was stolen from him throughout the mythical world. To return to the idea of the myth as a source of both pleasure and knowledge. Throughout the journey that has preceded this meeting, the young boy will encounter many stories, lines of poetry, works of art, and principles, and participate in many love meetings. These erotic encounters are not strictly distinguished from the works of fiction, and indeed life and fiction are never distinguished from one another, as they are, say, in the works of François Truffaut. So this priority of the flesh is the moving factor that dominates both narratives. Poetry as a way to deal with otherness, to communicate, to express oneself and even fly, like Yefim the villager, or feel intensely the love, like Nurandin, Pasolini's young lover, indeed has political associations and can be seen as a conscious stance, a precious gift to guide us all, to guide the artist in times of uncertainty, of movement, of turbulence. Thank you very much. I am open to questions.
Thank you, Ioannis. Ooh, okay. Again, benim ses yankılanıyor mu? Neyse, okay. We will have only one or two questions since we are over time here. Do we have any questions for any of the three presenters? Do they hear us, by the way, Igor and Ioannis? Do they hear us fine right now? Well, okay, Igor and Pop, Igor and Ioannis, do you hear us fine right now? Igor, Ioannis, do you hear us?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Igor or Ioannis, do you hear us? Ses mi açık değil? Igor, Ioannis, do you hear us right now? Okay. Igor, Ioannis, do you hear us right now? Do you hear us, Igor and Ioannis? Yes? Yes. Okay. Do we question? I guess not. So Igor, you wanted to receive some questions. We don't see any questions from the audiences. Do you hear us? Okay, Igor is here. Igor'un sesi kapalı. Hiç tepki de vermedi. Do you hear us, Igor? No. Ioannis, you hear us, right?
Yes, I can.
Okay, you do. We haven't received any questions from audiences. Is there any reflection that you would like to provide, maybe, connecting your approach to Tarkovsky and Pasolini to Igor's analysis in his paper, or maybe the zone of interest? Would you like to say anything? I didn't hear back from Igor. Is there any final note you'd like to provide? Now we can't hear Ioannis.
Had everything to do with my approach. in the sense that it focused on poetry, and poetry is exactly the missing link between corporeality and transcendence, right? And the way Igor spoke about subjectivism, the subjective, especially in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde,
Right.
I think it was exactly this focus on the individual, on our perception. So it was mostly illuminating to me as a context.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I definitely resonated with Igor's approach to the innovative aesthetics and cinema, the subjective camera, as you said in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and then Lady in the Lake, which is the first, I guess, of its example of that point of view subjective camera in cinematic aesthetic language, right, in the evolution of the cinematic aesthetic language. And it was the first use of this extreme level of subjectivity through the first person point of view, which was innovative. And of course, the film I talked about, Zone of Interest, provided another type of aesthetic language to us in the contemporary era with giving us two films in one by separating the soundtrack and providing the sounds of atrocity only through the sonic track of the movie. Igor, is there anything you would like to say last before we close? We didn't receive any questions.
I also very liked Ioannis' text. It was also focusing very on this sort of meta language, of the artist, when we create something, because I'm also an artist, like we are in some kind of a trance, but at the same time then we feel safe, and which is very close to Lacan, because he equalizes this feeling, like when we go to cinema we are like children again, and we feel sane. Unlike when we go out, we are again in the real world. And actually, I think that Ruben Mamoulian's film had the first POV camera, and he's noted for being an innovator. He did the first color movie, and then he did the first movie in one shot. And you can read about his article. I have the book here in my. I can turn on the camera, I can show you the book. It's called The American Cinema. It's a compilation of edited by Donald Staples, and the article about this article that I told you, it's a Ruben Mamoulian, the artistic innovator, an interview by Arthur Knight, and it has a big explanation. But also he was very engaged because one of his last movies was Silver Stockings, with the musical with Sid Cherries and Fred Astaire. It was actually a satirical version of the satirical movie Ninochka, because he was a refugee from Russia. And I also saw that when I applied with this text, I began to work on this paper actually last year. But in this last year, I noticed that there were so many other academics that were working on this subject matter. Maybe because our self is in danger, and I'm very sorry I didn't hear when it was the presentation about the zone of interest. I couldn't hear. I think I didn't see the presentation, unfortunately. No. But also this so movie is very much about losing the self, and so we are in the same line where maybe our civilization has this current momentum has something to do with it.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to thank all the presenters in our panel, and we are closing now. Thank you both, Igor and Ioannis, for participating in this conference.
Hope we could meet someday at some conference again.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much. Hope to meet
Symposium.
you in person. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.